Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of What's Happening. I'm George Binns, and the guest this evening is the Superintendent of Beverly School System, Dr. Suzanne Charochak.
Correct.
And also the new Director of Opportunity, Access, and Equity, Dr. Andre Morgan.
Good
Welcome
evening.
to it. So, the school's year is starting.
Yeah.
We had a little bit of opportunity, access, and equity last year. Mm-hmm. This year, I hope the system is much smoother because last year, I guess, was a bit of a challenge for everyone.
Let's say, to say the least, it will be less complex this year than it was last year.
So now that we're getting down to what we really want to do, what is it that we really want to do in the school system?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us. We appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm happy to come and be able to share with you things that we're working on in our schools. I think our mission, our goal is the same as it has always been, and that is to create opportunities for our students to get the best education that they can, to make sure that we're focused on college and career-ready outcomes for them so they're prepared for the world they're going to enter, and to make sure that the educational experience in Beverly is the best that it can be.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. One of the things that has bothered me a little bit is, this is an old joke that I like. If you talk to an engineer and you mention to him T&A, he thinks about temperature and altitude. Mm-hmm. And the other one that comes up is that nowadays we're talking about CRT. And to an engineer, that's a cathode ray tube. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the problems that we're having in society in general is something that was brought up by in 1984, the book by, and essentially the concerned men was a thing called newspeak. Now we got politically correct. So I think one of the problems we're struggling with is what do we really mean by a lot of these terms? And when you start to talk about your business of opportunity, access, and equity, they've got slightly different meanings than what normal people think of. One of them being that bothers me is when you want to talk about equity, you buy a house and you start paying off the mortgage, you're building up equity, which is value. We've had this discussion before where equity is more about fairness and equal outcomes. And yet, the first time I met you face-to-face this evening is you're a big, tall guy.
I am.
Yeah. And the chances of me playing basketball against you with any success is slim to none. So there's no way.
But we haven't seen him actually play yet, so we're not really sure.
You haven't seen me play either. Yeah. But again, there is the difference in the way we are that how do you have an equal outcome?
So that is a great opening for us, I think, and a lead-in for us to have the chance to talk with you about some of the things. So we've had the chance to watch some of your shows. I know you've had a few episodes in the last few weeks regarding critical race theory in particular. I'm not really sure where the connection to the schools were. I know that you also had a chance to speak with a couple of the school committee members. Yep. But I think we all have to be really careful about when we try to talk outside of our comfort zone around things. And for, as you said, CRT is an acronym. We use so many acronyms in the schools, in society, that we have to be careful what we're saying. But the idea about critical race theory in particular, I think we're happy to address some of the questions that that your episodes raise for us and probably for the community. So I think, do you want to start off and take that?
Absolutely. And George, let me say we want to offer an assessment of what critical race theory really is. Because we want to ensure that we're starting the conversation in the same place. And so it's our belief that when we discuss CRT being taught in our schools, we're really talking about two things that share the same acronym. There's critical race theory, and then there's culturally responsive teaching. And these are two different ideas. Okay. So critical race theory is an academic concept that's more than 40 years old. It emerged in the late 1970s, early 1980s.
Yeah, it used to be critical equity studies.
Yeah, and the core idea is that race is a social construct, and that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but it's also something embedded in our legal systems and policies of our society. So in the 1930s, government officials drew lines around areas deemed to be poor financial risk. And so I want to just take a couple of minutes because I don't want to just make a blanket statement, but I want to illustrate what that point means. So again, in the 1930s, government officials, they drew lines around areas that were deemed to be poor financial risk. And often it was explicitly due to the racial composition of the residents in those areas. And banks subsequently refused to offer mortgages to black people in those areas. And today, those same patterns of discrimination live on through race-blind policies. For example, single-family zoning that prevents the building of affordable housing in advantaged majority white neighborhoods, and thus it kind of stymies racial desegregation efforts. So we do not, and we have not, taught this in Beverly Public Schools. And I want to share a little bit of the why behind that. You know, when we talk about critical race theory, for one thing, much of the scholarship on critical race theory is written in academic language. Or it's published in journals, and that's not easily accessible to K through 12 teachers.
We were talking before we came on. The first time that either of us ever studied critical race theory was in my doctoral program. So I think in terms of where it lies in academia, the critical race theory itself is sort of in higher ed and beyond. So.
And I think that's part of the problem, that it gets into the jargon of the higher ed that is hard for people like me. I don't understand CRT. It's a cathode ray tube. You know, I'm coming from.
I don't understand the TNA thing you talked about there, and other people will think different things. So
okay, I'll explain that later.
Yeah, but you know, one of the unfortunate things, since you bring that point up, is that critical race theory is really now cited as the basis for all things that are diversity, inclusion, and belonging related, regardless of how much those concepts actually inform our programs. Yeah. And so, to that end, let me turn the attention to the other side of the table, because the culturally responsive teaching is actually an idea that we believe in, and it's being upheld in many school districts. Culturally responsive teaching.
What's an example of that?
Yeah.
How do you teach culturally responsible? What does that really come down to on the nuts and bolts of the classroom?
So it's a teaching approach.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? It's a teaching approach that seeks to affirm students' ethnic and racial backgrounds, and it's also intellectually rigorous. And so culturally responsive teaching does a number of different things, including it speaks to the social emotional needs of our students. It speaks to critical thinking needs. It speaks to the various way that we offer opportunities to each and every one of our students in the district.
It also speaks to the representation within the curriculum for all of the students. So we know that we have a diverse student body in Beverly. It's representative of the same diversity that the citizens of Beverly hold in our community, right? I think you had, I think Ms. Visnick was on your show a week ago and talked a little bit about that. I mean, 76% of our students are white. Yeah. That means that 24% of our students are non-white. Yeah. And on top of that, 28% of our students are economically disadvantaged, which means they come from a different poverty level. Yeah. 19% of our students have learning differences. So when we talk about this, we talk about the fact that the learning needs and the places from which people come to school is very different. But just like we want women to see themselves as scientists, and we want Hispanic Latino students to see themselves as strong in math, and we want students of color to know that they can excel in a STEM program, that really is what we're talking about. We're talking about making sure that all of our students feel a sense of belonging in our schools, and that our curriculum responds in a way that they're all successful, and that they all understand that we hold high expectations for them, and that we understand and that the need to differentiate amongst students in our classroom for all different kinds of reasons, to make sure their needs are met, to make sure they can be successful. And so I think part of what Andre just described is one of the approaches is this idea, and there's lots of study and lots of information and tools that we can give teachers in their toolkits that allow them to understand as they're teaching, to make sure they're meeting the needs of all of the kids that are in the classroom.
One of the things that came out of that discussion with Lorinda and John was this point you just made of 76% of the student body is European ancestry.
Well, white is the only way that we would describe.
I have a problem with that.
We all do. We know that. But those are the categories that's when you look at data, that's the data, that's how it's sorted.
I know, and I think that's part of the problem because there are no such thing as races in the species Homo sapiens. Our distant cousins, the pan troglodytes, they got 3 to 5 races. We don't have any. So we're talking about, as you mentioned earlier, it's a social construct. And
but not one that we created, but one that we use.
I know where it came from.
So when we look at data, we have to have some way to categorize that data, and we have required reporting and all of those things. But I think my point really is the idea that, we in Beverly, and this is not we haven't changed our approach on anything. We've gotten better at it. We've provided teachers with some new tools to use to be able to understand, among them, the universal design for learning and making sure that we have multiple means of representation and multiple ways that we can teach things so that we're able to reach all kids, because our students are not just all of one particular learning style or of one particular category. We have to make sure that we're doing all that.
But back to the point I was getting to is, Lorinda mentioned that as a result of the audit you did, you found out you've got 76%, I still like to call them European ancestry, and 24% of other ancestries. But the city of Beverly is 93% European, and
I'm not so sure about that. I would be more. I'd have to see the data on that. But I would be more inclined to believe that our schools are pretty representative of our community.
Well, that was one of the questions of how come that kind of a disparity between.
I wouldn't be able to speak to that because I don't collect the data for the city. But
I'd like to understand that. But anyway, back to the situation of you've got students that come from lots of different backgrounds, different talents, different shortcomings that need to be addressed. And that's where the opportunity and the access and equity come in. And when we did the show with John Mullady, he showed up a cartoon of 3 kids standing behind a I guess
very familiar with that cartoon.
It's the standard cartoon.
Yeah.
But it's 3 kids standing behind a wooden fence. And on the other side of the fence is the ball game. And one of the kids is like Andre, tall. He's just
He's looking right over the
fence. And the other 2 kids are varying heights. So they show a reshuffle of this situation where they have different sized boxes for the students who are short. And they said, okay, that's equity. But you still end up with the problem they're watching the game and they're not playing in it. So you can.
Well, I think the idea was I don't know that it was particularly about playing baseball. I think it was more about making sure that we were providing every individual of the 3 with what they needed to be able to see over the fence. So that was the goal of that cartoon.
They can see over the fence, but I think there's more to education just seeing over the fence. It's the involvement, the engagement of the students.
Yeah, and I think what you're addressing is talking about that sense of belonging. And I think that is one of the major focuses that we have in our district this year. We really, really are committed to making sure that all of our students, regardless of their background, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of race, feel like they belong in our schools. And
how do you do that?
Well,
this is part of the problem I'm having. Is I know all these good words, and you start rattling off the jargon, and
try not to use jargon too much.
But you're losing me. And I think this is what needs to be explained in plain English.
So let me jump in if I can, because I want to go back to a comment you had made in one of our previous discussions when I visited the show, and that was that every student doesn't learn in the same way. They don't get it the same way. And so perhaps that's the value of culturally responsive teaching, is to give our teaching teams the tools in order to help those students who don't get it in a traditional way to get it so that they can experience academic success both in school and in subsequent life. And so our goal as a district, and this was shared by Dr. Charochak in our district-wide staff meeting last week in our district-wide professional development, was an emphasis on focusing on the needs of every student, regardless of experience, background, or any other difference, if you will. And so that message really resonated because as part of that model of culturally responsive teaching, it's how do we reimagine our teaching practices such that we can focus on the needs of all students and not just focus on the majority, if you will. But how do we expand out so that even those students who may experience some challenges have the opportunity, have the access, and we're achieving equity, which is giving every student what he, she, and they need to be successful.
Well, that gets to one of my hot points that when they built this building, the new high school, they didn't include the updated version of the Claude Patton trade school. And when they built the new middle school, they left out the 2 floors, so we don't have 4 technology labs. So there is a need for what I consider hands-on learning, because that affects me personally. I am a very tactile individual in terms of things I do and how I do it. And the plain old academic world really is a challenge for me in that perspective. And so I see that as one of the, and this is one of the points we discussed with the assistant.
I was going to say, you had this conversation with Dr. Flaherty and with Mrs. Taylor.
Yeah.
The conversation around the pathways that they're creating and looking for.
And the issue in that particular case is how do we accommodate this lack of availability of tactile learning in the Beverly school system. And they mentioned the program where you have half a day in Beverly High School and the other half of the day out at Essex Tech. I mean, that's a good.
So I think that you're hitting the nail.
I'm trying to get to the same kind of nuts and bolts of you got a child who comes into the system. He or she is a minority or one of your disadvantaged. What do you do different for them that you don't do for the other students?
So I used a term earlier when we were talking, and I said universal design for learning. So the change that the shift that we're making and that we're trying to make with all of our teachers and providing them those tools and training is that while they're planning their lessons, they're thinking about that in advance. So how is this lesson going to be received? What are the multiple ways I can represent my information so that all of the learners in the classroom have access? What are the multiple forms of expression that I can allow so that I can understand what level of understanding the students in the classroom have had? But I think also, and you and I have talked about this one at length, project-based learning. So we do provide opportunities for project-based learning for students throughout the curriculum, throughout the grade levels. And we really do have an emphasis on making sure that our learning is authentic and realistic, and that we're making connections to real world problems so that students, that's one way to increase engagement for all students. So those are just a couple of the little ways. It all is embedded in the planning that we're doing. We have curriculum instructional coaches at the elementary, middle, and high school levels now, and they're working really hard with teachers to make sure that in that planning process we are designing and implementing lessons.
Give me a for instance.
For instance, project-based learning. So I'll go with an elementary literacy classroom. So we have a number of teachers that have attended some training over at Tufts University in something called novel engineering. And so what novel engineering is that when you're reading a novel or a text in a classroom, you use it as an opportunity for literacy. You're doing all of the typical literacy standards, but you're also building in some of those STEM standards. And so the STEM teachers coming in and working with the classroom teacher. And so in every novel that a second or third grader reads, there's a problem, and then there's a solution, right, if you think about the old plot chart, right? Well, we ask students, okay, you've read this novel, you've addressed some of the literacy standards, think of a different solution, and then build a different solution. So you'll see students in our elementary classrooms with opportunities to build bridges or snowshoes, or, I can think of a number of different examples based upon whatever book they were reading. And so we bring that build into the classroom because we really believe that for some kids it's that tactile experience or that rethinking. I mean, in the end, you asked what do we want? We want to build our Beverly Public School students to be critical thinkers, right? We want them to understand that there are many solutions to many problems. There are many perspectives to what they're reading. We want them to be able to distinguish between fact and false statements. We want them to think about the sources that they find information from. We want all of those critical thinking skills to be at the forefront of what we do. And so that's just an example of one place where we've taken literature, we've taken literacy skills, we've looked at the standards within literacy, but we've also drawn from the STEM standards, and we're bringing those into the classroom and making that connection so that all of those kids have a higher level of engagement with the story, with critical thinking, with the engineering practices that we might be introducing to them. So, I mean, that's one example.
Yeah. Well, I think this is the kind of stuff I think that as a parent you want to know, what are they actually doing? And I know you guys go to your group meetings and you all talk the jargon and everybody understands, oh yeah, I know what that means. But when a parent comes home, gets a kid coming home and they're doing something and you, what do you mean? Why are you doing that? Well, what's the basis for it? I think this is part of the message that I would like to get exploring a little more of. What are the real nuts and bolts of it? How are you making it happen? How does a parent recognize that something is different and it's better than it used to be? What makes it better? I mean, some of this stuff is not obvious because the point you're making is, okay, you sit down, you read a novel, and now you're trying to second guess the author, come up with a different solution, a different project. Well, what good is that? It's not obvious, I think, that...
well, if you compare a lesson where you do something like because when we think about, I think one of the things that's really interesting is the word rigor. A lot of people, we talk about, we want a rigorous curriculum. We want there to be a lot of rigor in what they learn. Well, rigor is really, the definition in my mind is how are you interacting with whatever you're learning? How deep is the interaction that you're having? So if you're reading text and you're interacting deeply with that text to first of all understand the perspective of the author, understand the perspective of the characters, think about different solutions for that characters. You're making that come to life, and you're utilizing critical thinking skills in a different way. Compare that to read chapter 3 and answer 3 questions at the end of the chapter, right? So there's a level of interaction with text. That's rigor, and holding high expectations for everyone to be able to have that level of interaction is really, I think that speaks to what you're talking about. I will say we're approaching the next couple of weeks for curriculum nights for parents. I encourage them to join. We are having, I think the high schools is Thursday night. It's virtual, so the opportunity to get on to a Google Meet and hear from your teacher about what the plans for the classroom are, what the expectations are, what you can expect. At the elementary schools, they'll be holding their curriculum nights in the coming weeks too. But any family, any parent, anybody that has questions about what's going on in their child's classroom should reach out to their child's teacher, because we really want that two-way communication.
So when you say you're going to have a Google Meet, is each classroom teacher having their own Google Meet?
Yep. Yeah.
Oh,
so
that's
parents.
neat.
Yeah. So we did it last year out of we had no choice, and
desperation.
And again, I think we are all still. I mean, we would like to think that the pandemic has come to its end and we don't have to do things, but I think we still need to take precautions, and we want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can. And so we kept the format for the high school, and they will be a parent will get their schedule, and they'll have a Google Meet link for every class that their child takes,
that's neat.
And they'll be able to walk through their child's schedule just virtually. So they'll sign into the Google Meet for the A period, B period, C period, and the teacher will be there and providing information about the class and expectations around the class. So,
and George, I want to add, we don't want parents to be siloed from the process, because this is a partnership.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that just about our entire team are parents, and so how we approach it is what type of education will we want for our own children.
Yeah.
And that's our model each and every day.
So that I think is a major innovation that I remember the old parents visiting days, and
standing in the hall and waiting your turn.
Lined up to get your private meeting.
Yeah.
And then the kid comes home and says, "What does he say
But this
about me
this
now?"
is more of an open house, so this is not a conference night. This is really an opportunity for the teachers to share what they're doing, and they'll be doing that at every building. So all of our elementary schools, our middle school teachers will all be sharing. It might be in a different way. I know that's the format for Thursday evening at the high school, and so I would encourage parents to take part in those. We did find that when we moved to a virtual platform last year, our participation and our engagement was higher because it was more convenient, and a lot more parents were able to kind of come and join us. So we are really happy about that and look forward to that.
Yeah. So I think as bad as this virtual learning is...
there's a silver lining in everything.
Yes.
And we are looking for those silver linings everywhere and hoping to take advantage of them.
It's the same thing with this business. I mean, to get somebody to the studio to do a show is a little complicated. But as we've demonstrated several times with Andre, that, hey, I'll Zoom to you and you answer the email and we got a show going. And it's at your convenience, at my convenience, and it just works.
I think the virtual meetings will probably stick around a lot longer than anything. I think we've found them to be helpful. That we utilize them for for a number of different. We do hybrid meetings too. So sometimes some people are in the room, and then other people are not. So sometimes we have a leadership meeting and 8 or 9 people are in the room, and 6 more are joining us from their office space. And so we found that provides flexibility, and flexibility is a good thing. So we appreciate that.
So you can just call a meeting and just nobody has to travel to get there. Just plug in. So anyway, we'll be coming to the tail end of this show, and I've been given the 5-minute warning. So do you have any closing remarks you'd like to make?
I think I just appreciate the opportunity to share with everyone what we're doing in the schools. We think that we know how important a sense of belonging is for all students, and we know how important the goals that we have around moving and making sure that all of our students are experiencing the best college and career-ready outcomes that they can. And that's what we're doing.
And early on in the show, you mentioned that you had looked at some of the other shows we have done on this subject. And you wanted to make some corrections. Did you get them all in?
I think Andre addressed pretty much for everyone, that sort of working definition of what critical race theory is and isn't. And I think, my goal as the superintendent of schools is to make sure that we are doing what we need to do to make sure all of our students are experiencing a really, really wonderful educational experience in the Beverly Public Schools.
So I'll put a bee in your bonnet that I've also looked into critical race theory, and I understand the history. It started out as a follow-up to the 1960s, 1970s change in attitude that people had. And one of the books I read or magazines I read said instead of teaching critical race theory, we ought to be teaching critical economic theory. Because as you pointed out, the red line was drawn around an area based on somebody's perception of if you're living in that area, you don't have enough money to pay a mortgage. And it turns out that low rent district happened to be populated by one particular ethnic group. And having grown up in Providence, I watched the switch between the various ethnic groups taking over areas. And the classic one for me is an area called Federal Hill. When my father was growing up out in Centerdale, just outside of Providence, you did not go to Federal Hill unless you brought all your buddies with you, because it was a tough Irish neighborhood. By the time I was growing up in Providence, it was a tough Italian neighborhood, and now it's gentrified. So I've watched this transition from one group to the next, and the same problems stay there. And one of the books I'm working on is Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our something or other, I forget it. And one of the points he makes in that in the low rent district, the people there have very little confidence in the court system or the police, and vice versa. So there's a difference in attitude that needs to be, I think, addressed. And I think this is one of the problems, bigger than Beverly, but it's one of the things that I think that doesn't get discussed. And So if you got some time to fiddle with the curriculum, and the other two I would like you to consider is, there's two books that I think every senior ought to read. One is 1984 by George Orwell, and he described politically correct long before it became possible. And the other is Two Cultures by C.P. Snow. And those two books, I think, describe what's going on in the world right now, and I think they're worthwhile considering. And anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and we'll do more shows along these lines. And again, if you have a different opinion, my email address shows up in the credits. Send me an email, and you too can sit here at the table and explain to me where I'm all totally screwed up. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you later.